Okay, take two. Welcome to Critical Wave Theory, and today we're going to be looking at something related to 1980s rock. That's right, it's not going to be a rap episode today or a country episode or whatever. Not looking at movies or TV shows or politics. So, White Lion's story is one of triumph and tension, an ascent to glam metal glory in the late 80s, followed by a rapid unraveling. So today I'm tracing their rise, their mighty roar, and their sudden silence. And the band formed in 1983 in New York City. Danish vocalist Mike Tramp had just moved from Denmark with his band Lion. In Brooklyn, he crossed paths with local guitarist Vito Bratta, a player whose skill would soon make waves, and together they co founded White Lion, the band in question, of course. Their debut, Fight to Survive, in 1985, set the stage, but their breakthrough came with their second album, Pride, released on June 22nd, 1987. So you can see already Pride, you get the theme like a Pride of Lions. Yeah, the band really kind of milked their name as far as the album titles go. And of course, Pride was a monster of an album, at least for the fans of the genre. Produced by Michael Wagner, it climbed to number 11 on the Billboard 200, stayed there for a year on the charts, and went double platinum in the US. So that's kind of impressive for a band to stay on the charts for a year. So it's a little bit odd that people don't talk about White Lion that often. Even if you're not a huge fan, you would think they'd come up more often in conversations, just for nostalgia reasons. The album gave us two major hits. First came Wait, released in June 1987. And at first, it barely made a ripple, but once MTV put the video into heavy rotation, the song shot up the charts, peaking at number 8. And that's an example of how MTV was often instrumental in bands' fame. It's pretty easy to sort of trash talk MTV now, especially when they're really just a pale ghost of a shadow of what they used to be. But back then they were basically like kingmakers. And sure, you have people like Jello Biafra of the Dead Kennedys who trash talked MTV even during the heyday. He wrote a song called MTV Get Off the Air. But nevertheless, they were, that the network was pretty instrumental in creating a lot of success for a lot of bands, including some bands who were more on the alternative side, including some punk rock bands, at the time. Even though when MTV kind of uh, came into being, they weren't exactly highlighting punk rock bands or a lot of non-mainstream bands, but it really did help. Bands like the Butthole Surfers. You also had bands like Revolting Cocks or Revco being highlighted on MTV. So it wasn't just people like White Lion or Bon Jovi or what have you. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little sidetracked here, and that might annoy some people, but I do want to put this in context here. And, that there was a softer side of White Lion too. So they weren't just like a glam metal band and nothing else. They weren't just a one trick pony. They had When the Children Cry, which was an acoustic ballad with a pacifist message, and it was released as the third single in October 1988. It reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 2 in Canada, really establishing the band as more than just glam metal firepower. And I know somebody personally who has trash talked the song when the children cry. He's making fun of it, saying that it's cringy and all that kind of stuff. And I get that, but to have a song that has like a sort of sort of positive and pacifistic message, I guess pacifist would be the proper way to say it. That was, I guess, respectable in its own right, as far as I'm concerned. Sure, I'm not gonna like listen to it like on a regular basis. It's not my favorite song or something, but I respect that back then, bands could have content like that, lyrics like that, and they could have success with it. And again, MTV deserves a little bit of credit there for getting that sort of messaging out there, which not every pop song has. A lot of pop music is just like a bunch of crap, like fluff, relationship songs, breakup songs, or like these phony baloney empowerment anthems, that aren't really convincing to me. Granted, some of those songs aren't that bad, but the point is that this was a song that was something different, and it's a band that kind of took a chance. And even though they were, this glam metal band, it's kind of refreshing that they had some actual messages in at least a few of their songs. And it wasn't just the records. White Lion lived on the road. They did a lot of touring. Starting mid 1987, they toured relentlessly, first supporting Fraley's Comet, then opening for Aerosmith, Ozzy Osbourne, and Kiss, who were, of course, giants, and they still are considered giants of the rock world. And, of course, I can't help but notice that a lot of these bands are dying off. Aerosmith is retired, Ozzy Osbourne has literally died, so you can't just say that rock is dying figuratively anymore. Like a lot of these classic rock bands, they're literally dying off, and I don't know what's gonna step into their place. I don't think rock music has truly died, but it's gonna be interesting to see if any bands ever going to recapture, I guess, the spirit of rock in the way that those bands did at the time. And by January 1988, White Lion was on AC/DC's Blow Up Your Video US tour, and that summer they hit the road with Striper. And the thing is that through it all, one thing stood out. That was Vito Bratta's guitar work. I'm probably mispronouncing his name. But anyway, his solos on tracks like Wait earned him praise as one of the most gifted guitarists of the era, even though, like I said, a lot of people seem to forget about this band. But at the time, he was considered a very innovative guitarist that a lot of other guitarists were talking about. And Guitar World and Guitar for the Practicing Musician both named him Best New Guitarist, and in September 1989, he landed on the cover of Guitar World. And if a guitarist right now was to be on the cover of Guitar World, it would still be a big deal, a little bit. But back then, it was like a truly momentous occasion because the guitar was really it may have been the dominant instrument in music, in popular music at least, um, at the time. I guess you could have a debate about whether it was some other instrument or guitar, but the guitar playing world was huge in the 70s through the 90s. And, I guess it started dying off sometime in the mid 90s. But back then, if you were on the cover of Guitar World, whew, that was a huge deal. And, people were emulating you. They were trying to figure out how to play your songs. And of course, some people would pick up the guitar in an attempt to get laid. And even though, yes, there are some chicks out there who do have a fetish for musicians, I've got a little bit of a news flash. It's not necessarily going to work out the way that you want it to. And I got sidetracked yet again. But, I'm speaking a little bit off the cuff here. Some people would complain about the episode being too scripted. Other people would complain about it being too freewheeling and too off the cuff. So I'm trying to find that middle ground here. But anyway, behind the success, cracks were forming in the White Lion exterior. Touring exhaustion, label disputes, and the seismic shock of grunge all played a part in the band's downfall. Yet the most significant factor might have been the personal rift at the band's core. Tramp later admitted that he and Bratta, despite their musical chemistry, quote, had no connection whatsoever except through music, end quote. So yeah, you can't really pin all of this on Kurt Cobain. In fact, a lot of these bands, sure, that there was a change in what was popular at the time, but it wasn't just the music exactly. It was also the just the rise of not just grunge, but you had hip hop, electronic music, R&B, and of course other metal bands. Like it wasn't all just glam metal. You had alternative metal that was emerging and new metal too. So I mean, people like to really pin all of it on Kurt Cobain, but there was really so much going on, and these almighty giants in the hair metal or glam metal world, they had a lot of competition all of a sudden, and people who at one point said they would never ever ever listen to rap music, well, a lot of them caved and they were like, oh, there actually are some rap songs that are good, and it kind of cut into their interest in rock at least a little bit. And even though there were always some diehard people who would never listen to any other genre, it was nevertheless true that you can't listen too easily to two different genres or two different bands at the same time. So there's a bit of an opportunity cost, you might say, when new genres explode onto the scene. You can't focus on one as much if you've got all these others going on and you're interested in all of them simultaneously. You can still like a lot of different forms of music, but the competitive factor is going to be there. That's just the way the marketplace works. And the music world, it's no different from any other business in that regard. You're gonna have some fluctuations in what is popular at a given time, and White Lion was really a victim of that. And the respect between the band members and the lack of personal connection perhaps went all the way back to their first meeting. However, it was an interesting story that I read about, and it involves Van Halen's Eruption. And it was back in 1982 at Brooklyn's legendary rock club called L'Amour, as in Louis L'Amour. I don't know if that's who it was named after, but that was the title of the club apparently. And Tramp's band Lion opened for Bratta's band Dreamer. And backstage, Tramp watched as the guitarist ripped through a flawless performance of Van Halen's Eruption, and he said that his jaw dropped because of his performance there. So it was the beginning of a partnership built more on awe and skill than anything else. So, when it's more about like the musicianship than anything else, you're not going to have as big of a connection. It's it's just one of those things. Like bands, a lot of it they do make it about the music or about the potential business opportunities of the music industry. And if there isn't a personal connection, well, there's going to be perhaps an element of feeling like it's fake, or like the band members are expendable and all that kind of stuff. So that is apparently a little bit what was going on here. So by September 1991, after touring their album Main Attraction, yes, Mane, like a lion's mane, White Lion played their final show at the Channel in Boston. So they really didn't have success for very long, and Tramp and Bratta officially split. A year later, Atlantic released the Best of White Lion, closing the chapter on one of glam metal's most unique stories. And White Lion's music still resonates with people, whether it's the soaring guitar lines of Vito Bratta, the heartfelt lyrics of Mike Tramp, or the reminder that behind the spotlight, bands often wrestle with their own fragility. And, there is an interesting story here, a little bit, even though it's not the most fascinating story ever told. I still have some interest in what makes a band successful and what makes them split up. And as a guitarist myself, I am still interested in stories of the guitar's rise and the guitar's kind of decline in the world of music because it's just not as big as it used to be. It would be in some ways nice if it made a resurgence and became as respectable as it was, but people just aren't that impressed by guitar players anymore. And maybe they're a little too unimpressed by it, frankly. And a little bit of that is due to guitarists themselves. You look at all these YouTube videos, and so much about them is just like, I can play the flashiest guitar solo, and this guitar sucks. It's like there's little appreciation for just the power of like a single note. Because let me tell you, if you're like a minimalist guitarist out there who still plays some decent music, like you're not gonna have that much of a chance on YouTube. That's just the way it is. Now I don't really consider myself a minimalist guitarist per se, but compared to some of these people out there who are like trying to be the fastest gun in the West and who play like the most complex things that they possibly can. My stuff just can't compete with that. It's too well, for one thing, I'm more of an avant-garde guitarist and an improviser, and I'm more interested in like the purity of the expression of the instrument. I like the rawness of it, like being able to pick something up and not necessarily knowing what I'm going to do. There's something cool about that. And sure, I can be experimental and a little bit far out there, and I kind of don't give a crap about what other people think. Sometimes maybe I'm a little bit too much like that, but I think a little bit of that gunslinger mentality kind of screwed over the guitar. And then along came like punk and grunge, and it was cool to hear these bands that didn't prioritize guitar solos, but in a way that they kind of did too much to kill off the cool guitar solo and stuff, to the point where it's like guitar solos ended up being way too rare. So I'd like to see a little bit of a balance between these different elements, where you could, I don't know, be a multifaceted guitarist and have a wide variety of tastes and, sort of maybe be able to appreciate this type of guitar while still respecting that type of playing. Like who cares if a guitarist messes up every once in a while, doesn't play the perfect notes, or just sometimes butchers things. It doesn't really matter that much. So anyway, I've sort of went on this wide tangent, but some of you out there might appreciate what I've said. So thanks for listening, and roar like a mighty lion.